If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring in you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
This is a special edition of the CapCon podcast. I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Albany Times-Union. We recently had a special guest come visit us here at the Hearst Media Center at the TU's offices. Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins sat down with me in front of an audience of about 100 people. I asked the Westchester Democrat whether lawmakers in the majority will consider revising the rather controversial criminal justice reforms passed by the Senate last year. We talked about her current take on the likelihood of legalizing recreational adult use marijuana in New York, her views on ethics reform, the governor's proposed Environmental Bond Act, and who will she support in the Democratic competition for the presidential nomination. It's all here in this special edition of the CapCon podcast. Thank you all very much for coming to the Hearst Media Center. I am Casey Seiler. As Tina just noted, this is my first Q&A as editor of this fine publication.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Senate Democratic Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins back to the Hearst Media Center for her second year in a row. As someone who appreciates transparency in government, we should all be glad that politicians of her stature are willing to sit up here and take questions from reporters, to make themselves available. It was one thing to be here a year ago, newly installed leader, still with that new leader aroma, fresh off the lot, as it were. It is considerably tougher. Oh, thanks, Mike.
I have to put on my my cape.
Like,
I'm like, people would think it's not
me. People would be like, who is this
I
person?
don't have my scarf.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, an Andrea Stewart-Cousins impersonator we brought up here this morning.
I mean, you couldn't prove it, so.
But it is considerably more robust in transparency to come back when, in fact, you have a year of kind of governance under your belt, as it were. And the backlash, frankly, that comes with that in many cases. So, but before we get to that, I wanted to start off, at the risk of offending my colleagues in the LCA, with a question that might be seen as something of a total softball. We're talking near the end of Black History Month and near the beginning of Women's History Month, and I wanted to ask you about remarks that you made earlier this month on the Senate floor acknowledging Black History Month, in which, for a considerable amount of those remarks, you chose to talk about the relationship between, the historic relationship between the civil rights struggle for African Americans and, as well, the prejudice and the alliance that grew with Jewish Americans and, in fact, the relationship that dealt with anti-Semitism really across the globe. I mean, that, I'll be very honest with you, when I first saw those remarks, I think as a series of tweets, I thought it was kind of a sort of remarkable act of rhetorical kind of generosity. So I just ask you to kind of, what kind of led you to make those remarks at this time?
Well, thank you for asking. And again, it's wonderful to be here. And congratulations on your promotion. I'm sure it's well deserved. And I certainly want to acknowledge, because we are in his district, and he's one of my great senators, Senator Neil Breslin, who is, thank you, always such a great champion for his constituents in the state. But again, I look at these opportunities, whether it's Black History Month or Women's History Month or what, I look at these times as opportunities where you can educate. And we always assume that everybody understands what's gone on in other people's lives. And I've come to know that they don't. They don't understand most of the time because we are so busy and we're so inundated with our own concerns that we might not even know what's gone on to impact ourselves. So you have something like Black History Month, where you have the opportunity to remind people of the contributions of the African American community, and I always make sure I remind people of things like Sarah Boone and creating the ironing board. I mean, just things that people don't know because it's just not part of what we're taught. But I also want to make sure that folks understand the relevancy of the struggle that we have every day and how other communities have helped each other in that struggle. And of course, last year, with all of the terrible anti-Semitic acts, right during Hanukkah, I said, because I'm in Westchester, just so you know, so my district is, part of Yonkers and White Plains and New Rochelle, Greenburgh, the river towns and Scarsdale. So I have an extremely diverse community. And so I'm at, Christmas tree lightings and Kinara lightings for Kwanzaa and menorah lightings for Hanukkah. And I kept running into my Jewish community members who were saying, maybe people just don't understand the relationship that the Jewish community and the Black community have had. And, maybe we should do things to teach people the important nexus and connection with communities that have been demonized or oppressed and people have tried to exterminate. We need to talk about that. So, as I said in my remarks, I talked to my good friend and colleague, Senator Shelley Mayer, because of the gerrymandering. We actually share half of those cities that I talked about. She has half, I have the other half. She's Jewish. And so I talked to her about doing what some of my constituents had asked, which is just giving more context in terms of this relationship and how important it is that we don't forget the shared history that we've had as a people and as a nation, because you tend to think that you're in this by yourself and you're not. And so we decided that we would do something in one of our schools. And then the other thing that was remarkable about this, when we started talking to the schools, we had some of the younger kids like, well, why do we have Black History Month anyway? They're insulted that it's just a month. They're insulted that it's February. It's like, it's minimizing and not even realizing that it's in February, not because the government said you had to do it in February, but because Dr. Carter G. Woodson said this was the month that gave us great heroes such as Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, whose birth month was February. And that's why we would do it. So that I realize there's so much education, and there's so much that this younger generation doesn't even know about why we're in this place. And it would be good to start at a school, start with kids, to create something that tells a larger story and reminds our Jewish community as they go through this spate of anti-Semitism, that there are allies and there are people who are willing to stand with them, and it's not just today. There's been a history of this. So it was a good opportunity. And again, we're going into Women's History Month, and we'll have another opportunity to educate people again so that folks are not just absorbed by the whole current and flow of this moment, which if you just get, stuck in this moment, you wonder what's going on. I mean, I do. I'm like, what is going on? But you have to start holding on to those things that kind of contextualize and make sense.
I just want to make sure. I'm afraid the scarf, it might be covering the lav mic.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no, but that's fine.
Everybody heard me?
Yeah, that's good. Whoops, it's going to slide.
I'm going to use my teacher voice so that.
So speaking of the value of the long view versus the short view, you've now been in this position about 14 months now. What is something that you perhaps didn't know at the outset of your taking on the role of majority leader, or perhaps knew but didn't understand in as much wonderful detail as you do now?
That's a very good question. You know, it was, and again, I see one of my other senators, Senator Jackson. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Senator Robert Jackson. You know, I was thinking, as you were saying this, one of the things that's different is, you know, the fact is that in the majority, you guys actually pay attention to what I say.
I've always paid attention to what you say.
You know, when you're new in the, whatever, you know, you're so excited about the fact that you got there. And I started with, last year, with 15 brand new people out of 39. And everybody was so excited about our opportunities as a majority. Many of the people who had been there had been waiting for this moment where we would be able to do our policies. And the 15 new people had really gotten there because many of them had overcome significant challenges in order to be there. So, you know,
and overcome significant incumbent Democrats in some cases.
That was the euphemism, the challenges.
Yes.
You know. So everybody came in with and you expect everybody when you show up after you've, you know, won all these great victories and you're here, that you expect everybody to pay attention to everything you say, especially in the media. And the fact is that they don't. They don't. You know, you're a legend in your mind, but, you know. So, you know, I found that out when I got there. In fact, I used to run into Karen DeWitt, and I would wonder, you know, in the ladies' room usually, and I'd wonder, like, doesn't she care, you know, that I'm in the ladies' room? Karen, and, you know, she didn't care.
Karen said, I was being discreet.
You know, she didn't care. But now, as the leader, you know, whatever I say, you know, people care, and then, you know, so you know, I realized, obviously, as the minority leader, you cared, but, you know, they pay attention more as you ascend the ladder. And I think that's something that kind of I always knew, but it's very, very clear now. But basically, I learn every day in this job, and my conference are the best teachers in the whole world. They really are. You know, because they said if there's ever been a group of people who have come for the right reasons at the right time, it's this group of people. You know, every single one of them. They said they didn't just, you know, show up there by chance. The people who hung on when we were wandering in the wilderness, and you all remember that, many of you do. But when we were wandering, they hung on with us because they knew that the big picture was more important than where we were in terms of our ability to deliver. That we had to continue to foster our dream of what democracy looked like, what progressive policy looked like, whether or not we had the opportunity to actually implement it. So they'd waited a very long time. And the people who came in because they had a vision to help us get to the point where people in New York in particular would be, you know, would once again have faith in their government and realize that we could function, that we could be pragmatic, that we can be progressive, and that we could actually represent, you know, the best vision for New York State and its people. So everyone came in and they've continued, you know, we all are on different, you know, parts of the spectrum and so on and so forth. But because everybody is there for public service and everybody understands that people expect us to be, you know, public servants and leaders, you know, we all figure out how to do it.
this is your second budget negotiation. What is it like being in the room, and that the negotiation room, not the ladies' room with Karen
no,
DeWitt?
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, last year was really the first year that you were,
That's right.
intimately involved in that process.
Yeah.
I mean, what is that like? It is cloistered, it is closed off to the general public.
Yeah, it's not, it's quite, it's just a room. There's nothing, nothing extraordinary. And like I said, I what was fascinating is that around the budget process, and I think when I was here last year, we hadn't quite even begun to go
No, it was
through
end of January, so
Yeah.
you really hadn't gotten down to the nitty gritty.
Yeah, so what I figured out, what I learned is that, when the governor puts forth his budget, and then we, both houses, do our one-house budgets, and we, in our one-house budgets, express our desires for the spending plan for the state. But again, the governor has an extraordinary amount of power in the budget process. So once the assembly does their one house and we do our one house, then our staffs actually get together and start talking about the things we agree on or don't agree on. So a lot of that stuff, gets negotiated. So then the staff can't figure out which is the best direction, then it gets kicked up to the higher levels of our staff. So, my chief of staff, Chantel Smith, other people will start talking about it. So the thing that happens in the room are like those things that every other level didn't figure out. So quite honestly, by the time it gets to us, most of the things have already been sorted through, and then it's just kind of the hardest decisions in which direction you want to go. So the room, is a tough room sometimes because, there are difficult decisions to make. But, it's been fascinating to be part of it. And like I said, and you all know I'm the first woman that's ever been in the room. So, I think last year I thought they were just like going to stop the room.
No more room. If
Yeah,
we've got to let a room in, we're not doing it anymore.
we're not doing that. And I do think it took a moment for people to figure out, like, what do we do with her,
Do you think it changes the
Yeah, it does.
dynamic?
Sure it does.
In what way?
Because anytime, you're used to certain things, no matter what. In your own lives, if you're used to a table, having this number of people who are always like this, and then you get somebody else, sitting in the chair where, Uncle Harry used to sit all the time, and it's like, wait a minute, it's not Uncle Harry anymore,
Well, based on what you know, do you think there was an element in that process of kind of macho posturing?
I do. Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Oh, I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. I'm sure people had to start thinking about, like, I know, you all are thinking, like, it must have changed extraordinarily. So, and so here I am, and I'm perfectly willing to, shake up the status quo. That's kind of what I do. Mm-hmm. So I don't mind doing it in big rooms or small.
So generally it seems like this session so far has been more problematic in the sense that last year there was more low-hanging fruit. There were so many initiatives that had been promised by Democratic candidates and by the conference, by you, for so many years. If we get into power, we are going to do these things. And you by and large did. Now, of course, this year brings, as noted, some of the backlash against many of those, or at least some of those measures. The biggest, I think it's fair to say, being the criminal justice reforms that were implemented last year that went into effect in mid-December and at the end of the year in some cases. Cash bail, the reforms to cash bail probably being chief among them. The green light law as well. Of course, we are locked in this dispute with the federal government over access to the DMV database. The Senate, of course, has offered amendments to the bail reforms that, sort of to summarize them, would eliminate cash bail altogether
Right.
and give judges limited discretion
Right.
on remand, essentially keeping people in
Right.
jail if they are seen as being a danger to the community or a flight risk.
Flight risk.
And those, the Senate's proposal seems to have driven a wedge between the Democratic Senate and the Democratic majority in the Assembly.
Right. So, again, because I'm an educator and I like to do this, I always proceed by telling people why we changed the bail system anyway. And I realize that a lot of people don't know that this has been a system that's been in place. The reason for bail, the stated reason for bail, was to prevent flight risk, period. That's it. And what we have seen over the years is an over-incarceration of poor people, mostly black, mostly brown, because they cannot afford the cost to get out. So we both commit the same crime, and you have $500, and I don't. I get to stay in jail for weeks or months or even sometimes years without necessarily a conviction, but because I don't have the money to get out. And that is why we changed the bail laws. And people who have not had these very difficult interactions with our criminal justice system might not have realized how, unfair and unjust the system has been. Might have thought that all these black and brown people laying around were just there because they're all criminals. And the reality is that for a good deal of them, their criminalization was because of their poverty. It was underscored by the case of Khalif Browder, and some people say, oh, I know what happened, it was Khalif Browder. Khalif Browder was one of, we don't know how many thousands and thousands of folks. It's just this kid who was accused of stealing a backpack years ago, was not able, his family could not pay the bail that they requested, and he wound up in jail for 3 years, unconvicted. And when he finally got the attention of people like Jay-Z and so on and so forth, he gets out. And you would have thought that his life would have now been, moving forward. And he was so emotionally disturbed that he wound up committing suicide. This is not a system that anybody wants to be part of, and we certainly did not and do not. The Assembly had been trying to pass bail reform for quite some time, but did not have a partner. When we, and the governor also had been talking about reforming this system, and so we were able to do it in the budget last year. And what we did is that we said that basically for nonviolent felonies and misdemeanors, there would not be any request for bail, period. And the bail system would remain in place for those violent felonies, et cetera. So that's what we did. We also changed the discovery law. Again, you had a system, we could go back to this very extreme Khalif Browder case, where, nobody's rushing to bring this case to an end. Sometimes you're in jail, and because you don't know what you're being actually accused of, you wind up pleading to something because you don't know what they really have, and they don't really have to tell you until, so what we tried to do is, fix the discovery. So, people are saying that you're being charged with something, what are you being charged with? What's the evidence? Give my defense an opportunity to defend me. You can't even defend somebody if you don't know what you're being accused of. And then to have a speedy trial so that you're not sitting there in name the place, Rikers or whatever for years. So we reformed all of it. It all came into effect at the beginning of the year. And because we are in an environment where fear seems to be, the overriding emotion, that if all else fails, let's just stoke fear. And so here we are in an environment where, there's just a lot of people saying, oh, everybody's getting out and da, da, da. And that's not the reality. However, as I said, there was obviously an education piece. A lot of people woke up, and there were all this conversation about this person's out. They weren't asked for bail. Why were they out? So on and so forth. And people didn't understand why all of a sudden we're having a conversation where all these criminals are out. So, we had numerous conversations with law enforcement, with DAs, with the attorneys, with advocates. We've been talking to them. And of course, as things roll out, you want to make sure that the intent of the law and the actual law match. And so we continue to talk. But of course, as we're seeing, some realities and some, hyperbole, a lot of hyperbole, we decided that, this problem still exists. Because you still have cash bail. So even if you don't have it in certain things, you still have it in a lot of other things. So the discretion, the same kinds of things that led us to have the first conversation, we've left in place. It's still a hybrid system. So if we really want to do this in a way that takes the criminalization out of poverty, then why don't we re-examine the whole thing, see how we could take away cash bail entirely, see how we could get back to the original plan of flight risk, and give judges who have discretion now around cash bail, give them guardrails, checklist kind of thing, only, very limited, that would allow you to remand someone. So that's the conversation we're having. So whether there's a wedge or not, I think, the Assembly, because they'd waited so long to have something done, and finally it was done, the initial reaction is like, oh, no, we can't do anything. But, I think all of us want to make sure that ultimately we do the right thing. And the right thing is to reform a system that really has been unjust. And I just want you to realize, too, just think, you're held because, your family can't pay the $1,000 to get you out. And while you're being held, you've now lost your job. You've lost where you live. Your family's falling apart. And, how do you regain that? And so then you wind up maybe pleading to something just because you want to get out. And now you've lost the next set of opportunities because now you've pled to this or that. I mean, and then the same time you'll start looking at these communities like, oh, they're so dysfunctional. Oh, they don't have, well, we can't continue to pretend that there is not a connection between what happens to people in their day-to-day lives and how it manifests in the broader community. You can't, we can't keep. So our conferences, neither one of us want to perpetuate a system like that.
Speaker Heastie has basically said, no, we need to let these reforms play out. It's too early to talk about kind of, refining them in this way. The governor has sort of kind of vaguely backed the idea of tweaking the law. Has he explicitly said, I back the Senate's proposal, or?
No, he hasn't.
Yeah,
but
right.
what he said is that was what I had thought when I first talked about bail reform. So I mean,
so he was there early on, is what he said.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's implying that he supports it. So
Yeah.
I mean,
In hindsight being 2020, do you look back and think that the budget was the best venue in which to do the criminal justice reforms? And I guess the question is kind of updated this year because the governor has said if adult use recreational marijuana legislation doesn't get done in the budget, it is probably not going to get done, which was his prediction last year as well.
Yeah, well, again, I think that's what happens. And he put certain things in the budget last year, including these bail reforms. I mean, some things, it's easier to get consensus around in the process of enacting the spending plan. So I don't think we would have been better if we had done it outside of the budget.
It was always going to be controversial.
It was always going to be controversial because change is hard. Anytime you change system, like you said, it's just going back to being in the room. I mean, I'm not saying it was sort of criminal justice hard, but you're used to certain things, and when things change, it causes a reaction. So the enactment, whether it was in the budget or out, is going to have some sort of reaction. But we do, what we want to do obviously is separate fact from fiction. But again, we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing as it relates to reforming this. So it doesn't, and certain things are easier to do in the budget. So those are the decisions you make in the room.
On recreational marijuana use, the sticking points, as far as I think the general public would say it appears to be a question of where's the revenue going to go,
right.
And is a significant enough portion of it going to go to assist communities of color that were disproportionately affected by the war on drugs.
Right.
Is that fair to say that is the state of play right now on that issue?
That is certainly a major sticking point because, again, following the same path that we'd gone down around criminal justice and how that worked out, it's the same thing with marijuana. 80% of the people who have gone to jail and got records around marijuana use are black and brown people. Although records show that there is no difference in terms of the percentage of any population as far as the use and the sale and all these things, drug use. And we know from the opioid, the fact is that it is in every community and absolutely proportionately the same. But the only people who were going to jail were the black and brown people for the most part, who were, caught with marijuana, sometimes, as little as a joint or, So we decided that as we are talking about how to legalize marijuana, in addition to the education piece that we want to make sure that we get right, we also want to make sure that the communities that were disparately impacted by the unequal enforcement of the marijuana laws will get some opportunity to benefit in the revenue producing part of this. And how does that look, and how does the equity piece play out? It's very important to us.
You weren't invited to go on the governor's four-state weed
Marijuana
tour, the marijuana tour?
Yeah, he took it all for himself.
What will keep the legislature and, of course, the governor busy after the budget negotiation? I'm sure it's as we're still like 5 weeks away. It's impossible to even think about, that there will be a morning after, to quote the Poseidon Adventure. But what issues do you think are going to be on the table? I guess we should sort of predicate that or precede that question by noting that the second half of session is going to be very different this year because, of course, of the the stepped-up primary, the earlier, vastly earlier primary.
That's right, and I will remind everyone also why that is, because it was part of what we promised in terms of our voting reforms. And so many of my constituents and constituents all over the state were saying, we have to vote so many times. The congressional primaries had been moved up to June because of the federal government saying that the people who are serving overseas did not have sufficient time to have input into the elections because their ballots, took a longer time getting in. So Congress was forced to make their primaries earlier. We in the state level still had our primaries in September. And then you had the general in November. So not only was it costing a lot of money to our boards of elections to have the primary this day and then this day and then so on, it was also kind of causing a fatigue. I think people were feeling that people were confused. They thought that they'd already voted. Why are we doing this again? So it's just sort of dampened the enthusiasm around. So we promised that we would not only give people early voting, because again, New York was one of those states that still pretended that if you weren't around on Tuesday to vote, you lose your opportunity, which made no sense. So we put early voting into place here in New York. Anybody use the early voting system? Thank you. Raise your hand high, show your neighbors. Okay, good. And then we decided that it was also important to save about $50 million by combining the primary. So now it's all in June. We are usually in session in June, but obviously we did not want to distract from the important people's business by being in June and being in the middle of elections. So when the speaker and I developed the calendar now, the calendar ends for the most part in May. So, but technically June 2nd will be the end of session. And so everything is kind of expedited. So we have to, statutorily finish our budget by April 1st. And whereas we would normally have 3 months then to roll out whatever legislative things we were going to roll out, we only have 2 months. So it also puts a lot of different pressures on, again, what do we do in the budget? Are there things that are, policy initiatives that we could do in the budget as opposed to, and then, how do we condense what's left over the ensuing 2 months? So, we're trying to, we're always concerned, I will say, to answer your question, we're always focused on certain things. We're always focused on, New York's economy. We're always focused on creating jobs. We're looking at, affordability for people, whether it's, college affordability, daycare affordability. We still got this vaping crisis going on. There's lots of things. We're always looking at how to create safer communities. Looking at gun violence prevention and so on. So there is, lots and lots of things that we continue to do. And I also want to say for our conference, we held 74 hearings. People have never seen this kind of activity around almost every single issue all over the state, so that people have an opportunity where they never had before as it relates to the Senate and the Senate policymaking to really have their voices heard. So we are always out in our communities. We're always having formal hearings about things, whether it's sexual harassment or climate or whatever. So we are always out there trying to figure out how do we do the best thing for the people.
What about the question of ethics reform,
Yeah.
which I know many members of your conference, James Skoufis among them, have raised, especially the question of whether or not the Joint Commission on Public Ethics is an effective body. The Times-Union, our Brendan Lyons, has done several stories on the leak investigation last year that has, I think, raised many questions about whether or not JCOPE is effective, and also, frankly, about whether or not the State Inspector General's office functioned effectively in investigating this alleged leak from JCOPE to the governor's office that was discussed between the governor and Carl Hastie, allegedly, and led to the resignation of a JCOPE commissioner last fall.
Yeah.
We mentioned this a day after a meeting of JCOPE. Its meetings since this story came to light have been very contentious, I think it's fair to say, internally contentious. And yesterday there was a comment made by one of the speaker's appointees, Jim Yates, who was himself sort of tangentially embroiled in the leak matter, who said, "I would just like everybody to know that that our functioning has been hindered because the Senate Majority Leader has not selected an appointee to JCOPE. We should note that the Senate Democrats get one
out of
member,
14.
Yeah.
One out of 14.
And the Senate Republicans, despite the fact that they're in the minority, get 3. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, which is why the comment was, again, and my comment back was, again, an educational one, because I did want to point out a couple of things. Because of the situation.
I love the way that you say educational. That's just great. It's like my response was an educational one.
I'm trying, again, I've come to the point where I don't assume anything.
Yeah.
And it's better just to tell people the truth. And so that's why we made sure that in addition to saying, because of the, reporting and the stories that have come out, with JCOPE, it is hard, frankly, to get somebody who wants to serve on this body. I did
If
have
anybody in the audience is interested in being the Senate appointee.
Raise your hand. Let me know. Come see me. But it's not that we never had an appointee. I had an excellent appointee for years. But I mean, it's a rough situation, as you have made it clear in your publication and beyond. So it's hard to get somebody, but for them to suggest that their activities are being impeded by the absence of 1 out of 14 people is just ridiculous. And so I made sure that in the response, the reality, and that is the problem, it really is the problem. So, and please know that my one appointee does not have any supermajority power. So, they don't have 15 votes to everyone else's. So it's a 1 vote. So I think ethics reform, has been something that we were really clear about and continue to be clear about. And those were things, hearings and so on that we had, and we came right in and closed the LLC loophole, and we continue to really foster an environment, I hope, that tells people that we understand it's important to be transparent. We understand it's important to be accountable. And you who entrust us with everything, really, have the right to believe that we are acting in your best interest.
Do you think JCOPE as currently, I swear this is the last question I'll ask about this, do you think JCOPE as currently structured and constituted is an effective ethics watchdog?
Well, you already indicated the situation. Our majority has 1 vote.
Yeah.
It's obviously, the construct, leaves a lot to be desired. And, I'm hoping that, going forward, we will address that. Because again, if you're going to have an entity that is taking a look at ethics and ethics reform, that entity should be best positioned to do that.
Your use of the word supermajority reminded me to ask,
yes.
What would the state Senate do if, in fact, your conference achieves a supermajority in this fall's elections? I mean, would it change much, or would it completely upend the operations of state government in all ways, shape, or form?
Of course
not. Okay.
So no, nothing is gonna. We're not here to upend the functioning of state government at all. As I've said, I've always sought parity with my friend and colleague, Speaker Hasty, he's got a supermajority of Democrats there. I think out of 150, he's got about 107, 108.
But for both houses to have a supermajority,
I want parity.
yeah, right.
You know, I mean, I want what he's got. So what's wrong with that? So right now, we have 40. You know, it only takes a couple more. I mean, I'm glad you like that. So,
That's not macho posturing. That's just a search for parity, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm just looking for what my colleague has. And so for us, you know, there are 63 senators, and, you know, a majority for us is 32. And when we came into this last election cycle, I had asked for 40, and sure enough, we started January with 40 Democrats in the chamber out of 63. And now I've just put out there that I'm looking for 43, which would give us the supermajority. And, you know, like I said, I think it would just be, you know, it would be good. We would have parity, and we would be able to continue to do what people expect us to do.
So we're talking, of course, in a presidential year as well, and of course the fortunes of the party on a national level have ripples for your conference, for Democrats writ large across the state. Do you have concerns about the prospect of any of your candidates running on a ticket that has at the top of it Bernie Sanders, or at the top of it Michael Bloomberg, or at the top of it any of the other still large field of Democratic candidates?
Okay, here's how
I can take them one by one if you want. But.
Don't. Because for me, you know, in so many ways, all politics, you know, is still local. And people want their representative to be somebody who reflects what they think. You know, again, you're not always going to agree with everybody you represent, but the things that we have focused on, whether it's, you know, the economy, education, you know, the things that people care about, I think is always going to be the most important part of an election, you know, a period, that's it. So I tell my senators, you know, forget about all of the above, focus on your constituents. Make sure you've got the best constituent service operation going. When somebody's, you know, knocking on your door saying, can you help me do this? You know, you make sure that you're doing that. So that's number one. That's first and foremost. And then again, we govern for the state. For us, and I think I could speak for, you know, my conference, you know, everybody's got, you know, a different person, and some people are undecided. But I think for us who, you know, really believe in the dream of America, I think we want to support that dream. So who's ever on the top of our party's ticket, we will be supportive of. Because right now, there is, I think, you know, such a stark contrast of what people thought this country represents. You know, we understand that in its founding documents, so many people who are in this room would not be in the room, period. You would not be able to take part in government and in decisions if you weren't a white landowning man, period. The ideals and how those founding documents laid out the vision is what we are striving for in our conference. And we appreciate the fact that, it's been 100 years since women have been able to vote. How ridiculous is that? But I mean, that's our reality. When we talk about Black history, my ancestors are 3/5 of a person. Only 3/5 because of the need to count people and create enough of a say in certain states, not because they actually wanted to value, Black people as human beings. That's the reality. But because the ideals were put out there, it allowed for the expansion of the table and the expansion of the vision. And for me, I'm looking at a space now in this 2020 election that is asking us in the most subtlest ways, and maybe not so subtle, to choose which vision is the American vision. Is it the one that is big enough and strong enough to include everyone? To make sure that, the rising tide is rising and it indeed lifts all boats? Is it big and broad enough to be able to be expansive as our capabilities to communicate with each other no matter where we are on the globe? Or is it one that is going to contract and go back to a place that says only certain people matter, only certain people can be involved? That's what we see in our conference. And so who's ever representing the expansion of the vital ideals of what we believe America represents, because for me to sit here as a first woman and a woman of color leading in a state like New York says that dream came pretty far. And I'm not somebody who's pulling up a ladder because I showed up. That's not what we do. So who's ever up there, they're my person. Because it's bigger than that. It's what happens for us going forward for centuries.
So you could have just said, I'll back the eventual Democratic candidate, but that was so much, that was much more sweeping and historically thoughtful. So.
Yeah, I just, because I don't want people to think that, whoever's there is, no, I don't, who's ever there is fine. As far as I'm concerned, anybody who's there is better than what we have because of, that's me,
So many of our attendees submitted questions. I hope a number of them have been addressed so far because they were, very much in my mind when I was putting together the discussions or the discussion topics. But here are just a couple that we haven't touched on that people wanted to know about. What is your view of the governor's $3 billion Environmental Bond Act proposal? And what programs do you think it should be spent on if it is approved?
I think that we have spent a lot of time, it was one of the reasons that we wanted to be in the majority as well. I mean, we had a previous majority that refused to actually acknowledge climate change. They refused to acknowledge the science. Our conference, did, as historic legislation as it relates to climate protection, and we believe that the environment matters, because of all the sweeping rhetoric and so on and so forth. If we don't have a planet, I guess it doesn't really matter who's in charge. So we do want to make sure that we, acknowledge our responsibility to maintain a healthy planet. So we're in the midst, obviously, of sorting that out in terms of what people want. I know I've got municipal officials in my villages and cities and towns who are trying to, make sure that on the ground, things get managed through this Bond Act. For example, I've had some of my municipal officials who are wondering if roads that were damaged, say, by storm runoff and so on and so forth could be included in this. So those are the kinds of conversations. Because again, all politics is local. It's one thing to say, oh, we have this, but if we've got things that are being impacted by climate change in our local communities, will that kind of bond help those kinds of things? So those are the kinds of things that we're working on as we work through what's included in this bond.
Another environmental question, do you support a carbon tax as a means to address climate change? I know that's been
We
proposed.
have not, we haven't had that discussion at all.
Are you willing to publicly pledge to try to repeal Civil Rights Law 50A? And for those who might not be familiar with 50A, and I swear I did not submit this question, 50A is a state law that bars the release of any records of public safety officers. It was passed in I believe the mid to late 70s, and court decisions have since expanded it to bar the public release of anything that could be construed as a personnel record or used in promotional decision for police officers, firefighters, a wide range of kind of public safety employees. And of course, the problem there that activists as well as many First Amendment groups have noted is that it prevents the release of records of bad cops, is sort of the most pressing problem. And in some cases, such as here in the city of Albany right now, it is being used to prevent even the release of body cam footage that, of course, you set up a body cam program essentially to promote trust and transparency. And 50A, a very expansive law now, has been used to kind of prevent that release.
Well, I'm not certainly here to publicly pledge anything. What we have done.
Oh, come on.
Come on. I did publicly pledge to support who's ever at the top of the Democratic ticket. But we have had hearings on 50A, so it's we're still gathering information, and we have not had a conference on it at all, but we're certainly aware of it. And we, as I said, have had more hearings on all kinds of issues than any other Senate majority ever, and that was a topic as well.
Do you think, and this is just from me, do you think the fact that there has been so much controversy surrounding the criminal justice reforms makes it less likely that 50A, which is of course a law that is supported robustly by law enforcement, will be less likely to get addressed, essentially until kind of the pushback over criminal justice reform has kind of resolved itself?
Well, like I said, I think it's reasonable to say that we have not reached any conclusion about 50A.
In regards to legislation concerning opioid addiction, will this be adequately addressed in the final budget negotiation?
Well, our conference has put out a lot of really important, again, changes. The package that we put out has to do with treatment, insurance, education. We are trying to really, again, and the education piece is so important because people need to understand the scope of this, and then insurance has to be cooperative in terms of making sure that everything's covered, and even finding ways to have other responsible parties know about our situation. So I believe that this will be a continued push from all of us in the budget and beyond, because it is a scourge, and it's again, like every other thing, it's impacting every community, and I think most people know someone that has been impacted by this. So we will continue to push, put the funding in, put the legislation in that makes at least treatment available, education available to change this.
That's all I got.
Is that all you got?
I really,
I love it.
I can't thank you enough for
You're
coming
so
in,
welcome.
and another frank discussion. I hope you'll come back next year, and we'll do this
love
again.
coming
We'll make
back,
it an
and I
annual thing.
thank the audience for getting
I
up
know.
so
Yeah,
early
exactly.
to be part of this. And again, you know, the fact that you're here just underscores, you know, how important it is, you know, to be connected with your government, local government, and so on. Our ears are open, our offices are open, and, you know, hopefully you will see yourselves reflected in a lot of the work that we do. So thank you so much for participating.
I too would like to thank everybody for coming, for being involved. And in closing words, I would just ask you to support local journalism.
Yes.
And thanks very much for
Yes.
coming. Have a great day.
Thank you.
That's it for this special edition of the CapCon podcast. Please remember that subscribing to the Albany Times-Union supports our outstanding journalism on subjects including the Capitol as well as many other topics. I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times-Union. For more, be sure to check out the Capitol Confidential blog at timesunion.com/Capitol with an O. And follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @TUCapcon.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times-Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring in you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times-Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe